But I don't do anything with the important phrase here. It says, the law was added because of transgressions. Okay? Because of transgressions. Notice it's plural. Okay? It doesn't say the law was added because of a transgression. Because what scholars typically do is they'll read Galatians 3:19 and they'll think, oh, well, the law was added because of what happened in Eden. In regard to Legion, if you have your, well, you don't need to look it up. I've given you enough here. The Exorcism of Legion is about more than suicidal swine. It's about theological messaging, which practically everything in the Gospels is. Legion recognizes that Jesus is rightful Lord of the country of the Gerasenes, which is part of Old Bashan. But in Jesus' day, it was under Gentile dominion. Now, if you look up Mark 1:24, Jesus is exorcising demons in Jewish territory. And if you compare that with Mark 5, where they're in the land of the Gerasenes, it's Gentile territory, the way that Legion addresses Jesus is significant. Because when he's in Gentile territory exorcising demons, anybody want to guess how Jesus is addressed? He is the Son of the Most High. Most High is the key term. Where do we see Most High language that matters for this whole supernatural theology? It's the Deuteronomy 32 thing. Okay, when the Most High divided up the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. Most High is a term you would use if you recognize this is the Most High God, and the territory that we control here, that the people around us think is Gentile turf, really isn't. Okay? It belongs to him. So he can go over to the Jews and exorcise demons there, but to make the point that, oh, I'm not just the Messiah for the Jew. I'm not just here to reclaim this little thing about the size of New Jersey, okay? I'm not just here to take that back. I'm also Lord of all the territory. Okay, I'm the Son of the Most High. I am the rightful heir to your turf too. And so again, it's theological signaling. So again, just hinging on, and again, this isn't new to me. Scholars have noticed this for a long time. Why is Legion, why this verbiage, all this kind of stuff. So I included that in the chapter. When we get to the epistles, how many of you follow the podcast? Don't laugh. You know what's coming. Okay, a handful of you. The depravity chapter and the head covering chapter are two things that I did podcast episodes on. In this chapter, again, I get to actually give you the textual citations in the chapter. And then the baptism one is really a slight rewrite of something in unseen realm. But the depravity, the key verse is Genesis 3:19. When Paul is talking about the law, okay, the law was added. It's the same passage where he talks about the law, essentially, being handed down by angels and whatnot. So I do a little bit of that in unseen realm, but I don't do anything with the important phrase here. It says, the law was added because of transgressions. Okay, because of transgressions. Notice it's plural. Okay, it doesn't say the law was added because of a transgression. Because what scholars typically do is they'll read Galatians 3:19 and they'll think, oh, well, the law was added because of what happened in Eden. Okay, it's a reference to the fall. And this chapter is based, again, he's also from Marquette. In his doctoral work, a guy named, his last name's Stewart. Can't remember his first name now. It'll come to me. But he did a paper at SBL, which is the Society of Biblical Literature, a few years ago. And the paper was entitled something like the law and transgressions and the bastard spirits and the birth of the Son of God. And so I looked at that in the program and I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to be at that one. Because I couldn't figure out for the life of me, what is this guy going to do? And it was awesome. Tyler Stewart, it was just awesome. And I afterwards I got his paper, but he argues, and I can give you the paper. I actually posted this on my website. And again, he said I could do that. He argues that when Paul says the law was added because of transgressions, he's not thinking about Eden. Just whose transgressions are we talking about? He's thinking of the Watchers and their corruptive influence on humanity. And so he goes through a whole panoply of Second Temple stuff and some grammatical stuff. And again, he says, if you read it this way, it answers certain questions that come in the chapter later on that scholars have kind of struggled with. What was Paul thinking? Because if you're tracking on Eden, then some of the proposed answers or some of the things Paul says don't seem to quite fit. And Stewart's like, yeah, there's a reason they don't fit, because he's not thinking that. If he's thinking this, then what he says over here and half a dozen other places makes sense. And so since Galatians 4, again, talks about the birth of the Son of God and in its relationship to the law and, how we're heirs and sons and all this kind of stuff, he links the two things again. He's saying, again, the birth of the Messiah is the real thing that would reverse the transgressions, not the law. The law was powerless to reverse these transgressions. The law was sort of like, to kind of either forestall or put a fence around or hold in the wickedness to a certain extent, but it couldn't really do anything more than that. And in fact, it became a thing that people would resist, again, because they're sinners. So it's a really interesting proposition. But I give you a whole chapter, again, of his argument with the passages and whatnot, and then talk about how it might fit in the bigger picture. I think he presents a really good case. The head covering, just go listen to episode 95. The head covering, the issue there is the phrase, because of the angels. And people have wondered about, well, why is Paul talking about, this head covering thing, and women, first part of the chapter, they should have their head covered. Then he changes and says, well, they do have a head covering. It's their hair. And, I'm telling you this because of the angels. It's like, what in the world is this guy on? What is he talking about? This chapter, again, and that episode of the podcast, this is going to sound, I always have to say it this way, this is going to sound like the craziest thing you've ever heard. So I'm just prepping you. I'm just prepping you if you've never heard this. Just go back and listen to episode 95 or get the book when it comes out. There's a guy named Troy Martin. He teaches at Xavier now, or he did when he wrote these articles. But I came across it was a series of 3 articles printed over the course of 11 years. It tells you how fast things get published in journals. But the first one was Martin's article where he argued that the head covering, like the woman's hair is her parabolaion, the head covering, is actually in Greek medical texts the word for testicle. And you think, what in the world does that have to do with anything? His whole article is going through Greek and Roman, Greco-Roman medical texts and showing, and he quotes Hippocrates a lot, he quotes Aristotle. They believed that a woman's hair assisted in fecundity. That is, when a woman had sex with a man, her hair, they believed, actually helped draw the semen up into her uterus through the course of her body so that she would get pregnant. That's why you don't cut it. Okay, you shouldn't do that. And that's also why it's a shame for a man to have long hair, according to Hippocrates, because the male role is to eject semen, not retain it. It's totally bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. But when you read what they thought of the function of a woman's hair versus men, everything Paul says in that passage makes sense. Yeah. It just makes sense. But it's so foreign to us that we know where babies come from. We talk about genetics and, do this in a petri dish. And they're not doing that at all. Okay, they're not doing that at all. This is Hippocrates, who at the time was like the leading figure. There's one great thing about the test of infertility. And that's just great, how it involves, having a woman smell something and the hair is involved. It's just the craziest stuff you've ever read. But if that's what you're thinking, if that's what's in your head, when you read Paul, you're like, oh, well, of course. Of course, when we're in church, we should wear a covering over our hair, because then it's an issue of modesty. Would you go to church and just expose your genitals? Would you do that? Would you do that? I mean, that's essentially what Paul's saying. You people are nuts. Of course, he's writing to the Corinthians, and they probably they're doing everything. So, he's like, you people are nuts. Of course, you should have your head covered when you go to pray and you do these things. And of course, it's a shame for a man to have long hair, again, because he's presupposing this function. A woman's hair is given to her as her covering, as her parabolaion. This is her glory, because it helps her to have children. And children are really important, okay? And then Paul throws in this thing about, now I'm also writing this because I'm expressing my concerns because of the angels. There's only one context for that.
Yeah.
Apparently in the back of Paul's mind, he's like, you better get this under control. You better watch what you're doing. You better again, wear the appropriate things. You better behave the appropriate way. You want to show that you belong to a man, you belong to your husband, you're going to be modest. You're going to control your sexuality, your sexual behavior, because if you don't, we've seen what can result from that. You're being watched, pun intended. Okay, so in Paul's mind, this was a concern for him. To us, it's this most throwaway, bizarre, what in the world does that have to do with anything? But again, if you're reading it through those eyes, everything in the chapter makes sense. Now, in terms of what we do today, I have Mennonites, in my family. I'm not going to go tell them, hey, don't, hey, let me tell you what the head covering is really about. I'm not going to, look, and one of them is a pastor too. It's like, look, if this is what you want to do, and your teaching point is modesty, whatever, go ahead. That's a good idea. You're fine there. But again, it has quite a different context than what you'd think.